Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 16th of December 2020 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now, before going through today's news analysis, please test yourself to these questions. The response to these questions have been given at the end of the video discussion. Now, the first article appears as a lead article on page number 6 and it is titled as Punjab Haryana need to look beyond MSP crops, that is, it needs to look beyond rice and wheat and rather shift to high value crops and promote non-farm activities. Now, before we discuss this particular article in much greater detail, let us first look into its background. See, when India became independent, India was primarily an agrarian economy. The agriculture sector contributed almost up to 51% of India's GDP and it employed more than 70% of India's workforce. However, because of the exploitative British policies between 1950 to 1970, we faced acute shortage of food and we were a net importer of food grains. So in a way we had food insecurity, but thanks to the Green Revolution that was launched during the late 1960s, this problem was solved. From a net importer of food grains, India has now become a net exporter of food grains. In fact, now the problem has got reversed. Earlier, we used to have the problem of shortage of food, but now we have the problem of surplus amount of food grain production. Particularly, the production of food grains has increased to more than 280 million tons and most of which is dominated basically by rice and wheat. In spite of this particular success of the Green Revolution, the Indian agriculture is presently facing an agrarian crisis on account of number of factors. First and foremost, the Green Revolution has made the agriculture sector highly input intensive. This has led to the over exploitation of the groundwater. This has also led to the over application of fertilizers and thus there has been a gradual decline in the soil fertility. Apart from that, because of excessive focus on rice and wheat, the Indian agriculture has come to be dominated by the rice wheat cropping system. There is less amount of emphasis on the diversification of Indian agriculture towards the allied sector as well as towards the other crops. Moreover, there has been a gradual decline in the yield of rice as well as wheat, and since because we are mainly growing rice and wheat and not emphasizing on the other crops, India has become a net importer of pulses as well as oil seeds. This has also led to an economic impact. For instance, in spite of increase in the agricultural production, the income levels of the farmers in case of India has remained stagnant. You would be surprised to know that according to government's estimates, the monthly income of an agricultural household happens to be around rupees 6,500, whereas their monthly expenditure is around rupees 6,250. So in a way, an average agriculture household is able to save only up to rupees 250. Apart from that, this particular article also highlights that on an annual basis, the income levels of the farmers in case of Haryana, it is increasing only by 1%. In case of Punjab, it is much worse at 0.6%. Further, as you must be aware, presently the Food Corporation of India is following the open-ended procurement policy for the procurement of rice and wheat from the farmers at the minimum support price. Now, because of such an open-ended procurement policy, the procurement of rice and wheat by the Food Corporation of India, this is much higher than our buffer stock requirements. Now, our buffer stock requirement for rice and wheat is around 90 million tons, but because of the open-ended procurement policy, the Food Corporation of India ends up procuring almost the double, that is almost around 90 million tons of rice and wheat. Now, various aspects of the open-ended procurement policies and its flaws we have already covered in our DNS dated 3rd of October 2020. Accordingly, this particular article highlights that in order to address the ecological, environmental and economic problems associated with the Green Revolution, The core green revolution states such as Punjab and Haryana, they need to shift from rice and wheat towards other high value crops, and at the same time we need to promote the non-farm activities in these states. So in order to enhance the income levels of the farmers in Punjab and Haryana, the farmers need to shift from rice and wheat and adopt the other high value crops, particularly the horticulture crops. As far as rice and wheat is concerned, we need to ensure that the rice and wheat are predominantly grown in the eastern part of India. Now the article that has appeared in today's newspaper, it is quite limited in scope since it predominantly focuses on Punjab and Haryana. But from the perspective of the UPSC examination, one needs to look at a larger picture and look at what strategies the government of India has to follow in order to double the income levels of the farmers at an all India level. See, according to the Committee on Doubling of Farmers' Income, that is the Dalwai panel, agriculture should be treated as an enterprise. As an enterprise, agriculture is predominantly involved in three activities, that is procurement of inputs, cultivation of agricultural crops, and marketing of agricultural produce. Hence, in order to double the income levels of the farmers, we would have to reduce the input costs and enhance the input use efficiency. We would have to enhance the productivity that can be done through the promotion of agricultural diversification. And third is to liberalize the agricultural marketing. As far as the liberalization of agriculture marketing is concerned, already in our DNS dated 1st of December 2020, we have done a critical analysis of the three farm acts passed by the Indian Parliament. In this particular DNS, we have discussed the pros and cons of the three farm acts, and we have also discussed as to what strategies should be adopted by the government of India to address the problems that could arise upon the implementation of these three farm acts. Accordingly, we will not go into this particular dimension. In today's news analysis, we shall focus mainly on two dimensions that are required to double the income levels of the farmers, that is reducing the input costs and enhancing the input use efficiency and to enhance the productivity. Now, based upon our video discussion, you should be in a position to write the answers to these three main questions for the practice after the discussion. So let us start our video analysis with what strategy should be adopted by the government of India in order to reduce the input costs and enhance the input use efficiency, particularly in terms of land, capital, water, labor, and then we will discuss about the need to promote the agricultural diversification. Now, the Indian agriculture uses a number of agricultural inputs such as land, labor, capital, water, and so on. But because of the Green Revolution, the Indian agriculture has become highly input intensive, and the resource use efficiency of the Indian agriculture has continuously been declining. So this in turn has led to higher input costs, unsustainable agricultural practices, and thus a decline in the income levels of the farmers. Now take for instance the fertilizers, that is NPK. Now these NPK fertilizers, ideally they have to be used in a balanced manner of 4:2:1, but in case of India there is over application of nitrogenous fertilizers, because of which the NPK ratio in case of India is around 7:3:1. So because of the overuse of the nitrogenous fertilizers, the overall soil fertility in case of India has continuously been declining. So the decline in the soil fertility in the long run could in turn lead to decline in the income levels of the farmers. So each of these agricultural inputs is not used efficiently and thus has an impact on the agricultural income. So let's start with the agricultural input in the form of agricultural land. Now the net sown area or the total area under agriculture, this is around 141 million hectares. So if you look at the total geographical area of India, it is 328 million hectares. So a vast amount of geographical area in case of India is under agriculture. However, in spite of the fact that a vast amount of land is under agriculture, land as an input it is not used efficiently. This is so because the agriculture land holdings in case of India is come to be dominated by the small and marginal farmers. These small and marginal farmers account for 83% of the farming community, but they own 48% of the agricultural land. So the agricultural land holdings in case of India is highly fragmented. So these small and marginal farmers do not have access to formal credit, because of which they will not be in a position to undertake investment. Moreover, their marketable surplus is quite lower, which translates into lower bargaining power when they are going to sell their agricultural produce. The yield of these fragmented land holdings is also lower. So this in turn translates into lower incomes and a debt trap for the small and marginal farmers. So the fragmented land holdings is considered to be one of the biggest hindrances for the doubling the income levels of the farmers. So in order to address the problems associated with the fragmented land holdings, the Niti Aayog has come up with a model Agriculture Land Lease Act. This particular model act has been circulated among the states for its adoption. This is so because land as a subject, it is placed under the state list, and hence it is up to the states whether they would want to legalize the tenancy in the agricultural land or not. But what exactly is the leasing of the agricultural land? Now let's say you own a house or a commercial property. Now you can lease out your house or a commercial property to someone else, and by leasing out such a property, you can earn a rent on such lease. So the leasing of agricultural land also works in a similar manner. Now for example, let's say we have two farmers, that is farmer A and farmer B. Both these farmers are cultivating an agricultural land of say around 1 hectares. So if we legalize the leasing of agricultural land, the farmer B here, he can lease his agricultural land to farmer A. So by leasing his agricultural land, the farmer B, he can migrate to urban areas and get gainfully employed. At the same time, the farmer B would also be able to earn the rent on his agricultural land. As far as farmer A is concerned, earlier the farmer A was cultivating only 1 hectare of agricultural land, but by leasing in additional 1 hectare, now he would be able to cultivate 2 hectares of agricultural land. So this leasing of agricultural land would be in a form of a written contract. So this written contract can be used by him in order to take the loans from the banks and thus increase the investment in the agricultural land. Moreover, since the leasing is in form of a written contract, the amount of rent that would be paid by him, that would be regulated by the government of India, and there would be no forced eviction. So it's a benefit for farmer A as well. As far as the benefit for the economy is concerned, we would be able to avoid this vicious cycle of fragmented land holdings and thus consolidate the land holdings. We would be able to reduce the disguised unemployment. We would be able to promote equity in land ownership, promote occupational mobility, and thus boost the agricultural productivity. Now the problem in case of India is most of the states have not legalized the tenancy in the agricultural land, because of which most of the leasing of agricultural land is quite informal and oral in nature. See, when the leasing of agricultural land is informal or oral in nature, there is no written contract. In absence of such a written contract, the farmers would not be able to take loans from the banks and increase investment. The rent which can be charged is not regulated, and there could be forced eviction. Apart from that, if we do not legalize the tenancy in the agricultural land, the farmers may be reluctant to lease out their agricultural land. Instead, the farmers may decide to keep their agricultural land fallow. That is, they do not cultivate anything on their agricultural land and simply move to the urban areas. So if we legalize the leasing of agricultural land, we would also be able to reduce the area under the fallow land. So that is why the Niti Aayog has proposed that all the states should legalize the tenancy in the agricultural land. So it would be a win and win situation for each and every stakeholder in the Indian economy. Now this particular topic of leasing of agricultural land is quite important because in Mains 2015 we had a question as to whether should we promote contract farming and land leasing in the Indian agriculture. See, according to Niti Aayog's Composite Water Management Index report, India is presently facing its worst water crisis in its history. By the end of 2030, the demand for drinking water will outstrip its supply. Almost around 2.4 lakh people across India are dying every year because of lack of access to clean and safe drinking water. So if we have to solve the present water crisis, we would have to enhance the water use efficiency in the Indian agriculture. This is so because agriculture sector accounts for more than 80% of the water consumption in India, out of which the share of the groundwater is quite high at 60%. Apart from that, even today, 52% of the agriculture land is rain-fed, and the yield of this rain-fed agriculture land is almost 3 times lower than the irrigated agricultural land. So the overconsumption of water in the Indian agriculture can be attributed to a number of factors. For example, a higher proportion of cultivated area is under various crops which consume more amount of water, crops such as rice, sugarcane, etc. In fact, the economic survey has highlighted that India, even though it is facing a water crisis, India is a net water exporting country. Now, we call India to be a net water exporting country because if you look at our export basket, the export basket has come to be dominated by the water intensive crops such as rice. China, on the other hand, is considered to be net water importing country. This is so because the export basket of China is dominated by less water intensive crops such as the horticultural crops. The overusage of the groundwater could be attributed to the British era law known as the Easement Act. See, under the Easement Act, if you own a piece of agriculture land, the water beneath that agriculture land becomes your private property. So while the surface water such as ponds, lakes, rivers, etc., they are considered as a public property, the groundwater in case of India, it is considered as a private property. So since the groundwater is treated as a private property, the farmers need not take prior approval or the permission for digging a borewell. There is no regulation as to how much of groundwater can be extracted and so on. So this in turn leads to over exploitation of the groundwater. Apart from that, the free power which is provided in states such as Punjab and Haryana has also led to the over exploitation of the groundwater. So the over exploitation of groundwater has not only led to the depletion of the water table, it has also led to the decrease in the soil fertility. So the question is how to enhance the water use efficiency in the Indian agriculture. See, as far as the rain-fed areas are concerned, in the rain-fed areas, we need to focus more upon the rainwater harvesting. So as part of rainwater harvesting, we need to construct more number of check dams. We could also have a greater convergence between MG Narega and water conservation. So wherein a certain amount of funds for the MG Narega can be used for the desilting of ponds and various water bodies. We can also focus on the conservation agricultural practices such as natural mulching and zero tillage. Conservation agriculture basically means whatever moisture is there in the soil, this moisture should not be lost due to evapotranspiration. This can be done by covering the agricultural land with a crop residue or with a minimal disturbance to the soil, that is a zero tillage. Apart from that, in order to optimally utilize the groundwater, the Ministry of Water Resources has asked the states to adopt a model bill. As part of the model bill, we need to control and regulate the extraction of the groundwater. So the states need to set up a groundwater regulating authority. Such a groundwater regulating authority has to provide for compulsory registration of the borewell owners. Farmers need to take prior permission from this particular authority in order to dig a new borewell. This authority will also lay down restrictions on the depth of the borewell and so on. Further, we also need to rationalize the power subsidies in order to prevent the over exploitation of the groundwater. Apart from that, we also need to promote the micro irrigation techniques such as the drip and sprinkler irrigation. In fact, according to the Committee on Doubling of Farmers' Income, by adopting the micro irrigation, we would be able to enhance the income levels of the farmers by almost up to 50%. As far as the fertigation is concerned, please do let us know in the comment section as to what is fertigation and what are its advantages. This becomes quite important because a rated question has already been asked in prelims 2020. Now coming to next agricultural input, that is capital, wherein we'll discuss in terms of subsidies versus public investment. See, public investment basically means an investment that is done by the government of India in the field of agriculture. Such kind of investment is inclusive, that is, it benefits all the farmers, including the small and marginal farmers. It promotes environmentally sustainable practices, and more importantly, it addresses the structural problems afflicting the Indian agriculture. On the other hand, subsidies include the minimum support price, fertilizers, power, subsidies on water, farm loan waivers, etc. Now, if you look at the total amount of investment in the Indian agriculture, this is 15% of the agricultural GDP. On the other hand, if you look at the total investment of the Indian economy, this is around 30% of India's GDP. So when we say investment in agriculture, we are expressing in terms of percentage of agricultural GDP, whereas investment of the Indian economy, we are expressing it in terms of percentage of entire India's GDP. Now, as you can see, first and foremost, we are investing quite less amount of money in the Indian agriculture. Secondly, out of this 15 percentage, the share of public investment or the government investment is only around 3 percentage. Maximum amount of investment is basically done by the private sector and the farmers, whose share is as high as around 12 percentage. So this clearly shows that the government investment in the Indian agriculture is quite lower. So the government is spending less amount of money on public investment in terms of expanding the irrigation facilities, improving the agriculture marketing infrastructure, investment in research and development for development of new varieties of seeds, investment in improving the agricultural mechanization, and so on. On the other hand, the government is spending more amount of money on providing the agricultural subsidies. So much so that the agricultural subsidies amounts to almost around 8.2% of agricultural GDP. So as you can see here, the government is spending only 3% of agricultural GDP on public investment, but it is spending 8.2% of the agricultural GDP on providing various form of subsidies. Now the problem with these subsidies is that they are exclusionary, environmentally unsustainable, they create distortions, and more importantly, they do not address the structural problems. Take for instance the minimum support price. According to Shanta Kumar Committee on the FCI reforms, the MSP is benefiting only 6% of the farmers. So it is not benefiting the small and marginal farmers. Secondly, we have seen as to how over application of fertilizers, power, water, etc. is promoting environmentally unsustainable practices. Thirdly, it is creating distortions in the Indian economy. We have seen as to how open-ended procurement policy has led to procurement that is higher than our buffer stock requirements. And lastly, it does not address the structural problems. Take for instance, in the year 2016-17, the government of India spent almost around 3.1 lakh crore on providing the farm loan waivers. But the problem here is that these farm loan waivers basically benefit the rich farmers who take loans from the banks. They normally do not benefit the small and marginal farmers who do not avail the institutional credit. It is being said that if this amount, that is 3.1 lakh crore, had instead been invested in improving the irrigation potential in case of India would have got increased by almost around 55%. Hence, by enhancing the public investment, we could have actually solved the structural problem of poor irrigation facilities in the Indian agriculture. So accordingly, going forward, what we need to do is we need to rationalize the subsidies, that is provide the subsidies only to those poor and marginal farmers, and whatever savings we are incurring on rationalizing these subsidies, these savings should instead be used for enhancing the public investment in the Indian agriculture. Now, so far we have discussed as to how various agricultural inputs such as land, water, capital have to be efficiently utilized. Now coming to second dimension as to how we have to enhance the productivity of the Indian agriculture by agricultural diversification. See, when we say agricultural diversification, it basically has two connotations. The first one is to shift from monocropping to multi-cropping with focus on various crops such as horticultural crops, pulses, oilseeds, etc. And the second connotation is to focus on the allied activities such as animal husbandry, poultry, fisheries, apiculture, that is rearing of honeybees, sericulture, and so on. It is being said that by promoting agricultural diversification, we would not only be able to enhance the income levels of the farmers, but we would also be able to ensure nutritional security and promote greater amount of employment opportunities. As far as the promotion of nutritional security is concerned, see, when we say food security, the food security comprises of four A's. These four A's are availability, accessibility, affordability, and adequacy. Adequacy basically means ability of the people to have balanced and nutritious diet. That is, the diet of the people should not only be dominated by rice and wheat, it should also be dominated by protein based foods such as egg, fish, meat, milk, pulses. It should be dominated by fruits and vegetables. This is so because these protein based foods plus fruits and vegetables, they can take care of various vitamins and micronutrients that are necessary for a healthy human being. In absence of these protein based foods and fruits and vegetables, if a person is consuming only rice and wheat, such a person would obviously suffer from micronutrient deficiency, vitamin deficiency, iron deficiency, and so on. So if you look at the production basket of the Indian agriculture, the production basket has come to be dominated by rice and wheat. On the other hand, if you look at the consumption pattern of people, that is as to what people want to consume, as the per capita income of Indians has increased, now people would want to consume more of protein based foods such as egg, fish, meat, milk, pulses, etc. They would also want to consume more amount of fruits and vegetables. As highlighted, the consumption of these commodities is extremely critical in order to address the malnutrition in case of India. However, since the Indian agriculture, its production basket has come to be dominated by only rice and wheat, there is greater amount of demand supply mismatch as far as these protein based foods as well as fruits and vegetables is concerned. So in a way, this lack of coherence between production basket of the Indian agriculture and consumption pattern of the people has in turn led to lack of nutritional security. So unless the production basket of the Indian agriculture gets diversified, we would not be able to address the problem of malnutrition. So enhancing the food grain production alone will not lead to enhancement in the food security. We would have to diversify our Indian agriculture in order to ensure the food security. Secondly, as per the Dalwai panel, expansion in agricultural diversification by 1 hectare of agricultural land, this could lead to increase in the annual income of the farmers by almost around 1 lakh. This is on account of multiple factors. First and foremost, if you look at the cropping pattern in case of India, the cereal crops, they occupy 42% of the agricultural land, but they contribute only 20% of the agricultural GDP. On the other hand, if you look at the high value horticultural crops, they occupy only 14% of the agricultural land, but yet they contribute 33% of the agricultural GDP. So obviously growing of horticultural crops is considered to be more productive as comparable to growing of the cereal crops. Apart from that, as the farmers get diversified towards the horticultural crops, the agricultural production would be aligned with the demand and thus the farmer would be able to earn higher prices. Thirdly, these horticultural crops are basically short duration crops and hence the cropping intensity would increase. That means in a single year, the farmers can grow horticulture crops multiple times and thus they can earn more amount of money. Apart from that, by promoting agriculture diversification, we would be able to reduce the risk and ensure constant flow of income. Thirdly, the agriculture diversification can also give fillip to the secondary agriculture. See, secondary agriculture basically refers to any cottage-based industry in the rural area that either uses the agricultural products as raw material or provides agricultural inputs. It uses locally available skills to produce goods and services, and more importantly, it can be categorized as a micro, small, and medium enterprise according to the government's definition. Take for instance, an farmer producer organization that is undertaking the food processing of various horticultural commodities such as tomatoes, potatoes, etc. This is a form of secondary agriculture. It can also be a rural enterprise that is providing various agricultural inputs such as seeds, vermicompost, fertilizers, etc. It could be a women-led self-help group that is providing credit to the farmers. It could be an enterprise that is providing agricultural machineries on a rental basis and so on. So agriculture diversification can also give a boost to secondary agriculture, which in turn can lead to promotion of non-farm activities. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 7 and is titled as Law and Disorder. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Polity and Governance. Before I get into the discussion of this particular article, let me first highlight the background. See, there is a direct correlationship between good governance and rule of law. Rule of law is a feature that is characterized by a number of conditions such as absence of arbitrary power, uniform application of the laws, and enforcement of these laws by the courts. So if a particular country is able to enforce the rule of law, it will be able to foster good governance. Good governance in turn would promote social stability, economic stability, and thus promote economic growth and development. So you must have come across a large number of countries who have not been able to maintain the rule of law, and since they have not been able to maintain the rule of law, automatically there has been political, social and economic instability in these countries. So the preamble to the Indian Constitution states that the role of the state shall be to secure justice, that is social, economic and political justice to all the Indian citizens. Apart from that, the Directive Principles of State Policy, Article 39A, seeks to provide for free legal aid to the poor. So access to justice is considered to be the most important aspect of rule of law. As part of such access to justice, if your rights are violated, you should be able to file a case before a court. The court should be able to hear those cases on time, and these cases should be disposed as early as possible. However, in case of India, there are a number of constraints in having access to justice before the Indian courts. First and foremost, almost up to 3.5 crore cases are pending across multiple courts in India. Out of the 3.5 crore cases which are pending across the multiple courts, 87% of the cases are basically pending before the district and subordinate courts, and the remaining cases are pending before the high courts and the supreme courts. Apart from that, if you look at the average disposable time, that is how much time is basically taken in order to clear the cases. The average disposable time for both civil cases as well as criminal cases in case of India, this is much higher as compared to the other countries. Further, if you look at the judge population ratio, which is normally expressed in terms of judges per million, in US it is 100 judges per million, in Canada it is 75 judges per million, in UK it is 50 judges per million. However, in case of India, it is hardly around 19 judges per million. Apart from that, the district and subordinate courts in case of India are working at only around 80% of their sanctioned strength. So there are a number of constraints in having access to justice before the Indian courts. Accordingly, a main question for the practice here could be, there is a direct relationship between good governance and rule of law. In the light of this statement, highlight various constraints in access to justice before the Indian courts. Also, discuss the measures required to be adopted to address these constraints. So let us discuss as to what strategies the government should adopt in order to address these constraints. First and foremost, after accounting for the summer vacation, winter vacation, weekends and public holidays, the number of working days of the Indian judiciary is quite lower. For example, the number of working days of the Supreme Court in the year 2019 was hardly around 194. For the High Courts, it was on an average 232 days. For the District Courts, it was 244. Considering the fact that almost 3.5 crore cases are pending across the multiple courts, there is a need to increase the number of working days of the Indian judiciary. Secondly, as highlighted before, presently the district and subordinate courts, they account for almost around 87% of the pending cases, and moreover these courts, they are working at their sanction strength of only up to 80%. So these courts do have a vacancy of almost around 20% of the judges. So going forward, we need to fill up the vacancies in the district and subordinate courts. Thirdly, the total number of judges in the Supreme Court or the sanctioned strength of the Supreme Court has been provided under the Supreme Court Number of Judges Act 1956. Prior to the year 2019, the sanctioned strength of the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice of India, this was at 31. In the year 2019, the government decided to amend this particular act, and it has decided to increase the strength of the Supreme Court judges to 34, including the Chief Justice of India. However, according to a number of legal experts, if the Supreme Court has to clear its pendency of cases, the sanctioned strength of the Supreme Court has to increase to 36. So accordingly, this particular act has to be amended and the sanctioned strength of the Supreme Court has to be increased to 36. The next aspect is to create a separate cadre of Indian courts and tribunal services. See, presently in case of India, the judicial authorities not only take care of the judicial functions, but they also take care of the administrative functions. Now, so far, in order to make the Indian courts more productive, we have basically emphasized on two important aspects. First one is to increase the quantity of judges, and second one is to improve the quality of the judges. However, we have not given due amount of emphasis on improving the judicial administration. So since presently it is the judicial authorities who are carrying out both judicial and administrative functions, it not only leads to overburdening the judicial authorities, but it also leads to poor judicial administration. Hence, according to the Economic Survey 2018-19, there is a need to set up Indian courts and tribunal services. The main role of this particular cadre would be to provide the administrative support functions which are required by the judges. It will identify the various process inefficiencies in the Indian courts, try to identify as to what are the administrative bottlenecks that have led to increase in the pendency of cases, and accordingly advise the judiciary on what kind of legal reforms have to be introduced in order to expedite the completion of the cases. It is to be noted that such kind of dedicated cadre has already been set up in number of countries such as USA, Britain as well as Canada. Nextly, deployment of technology can make the Indian courts more productive. For example, presently the Indian government is implementing a e-governance project known as the e-courts. Now the e-courts has been launched by the government of India in order to simplify the judicial administration and enhance the productivity of the Indian courts. Now through the e-courts mission mode project, we have been able to set up the National Judicial Data Grid. The National Judicial Data Grid has been set up in order to monitor the pendency of cases on a real-time basis. So through this grid, we would get to know as to how many cases are pending across the different courts, how much time has been taken in order to clear these cases, and so on. So both the e-court project as well as the National Judicial Data Grid has acted as a critical policy input in order to make the Indian courts more productive. And lastly, as you all must be aware, in order to reduce the burden on the normal courts, we have set up a large number of tribunals. However, the problem which has arisen is most of the functions of these tribunals are overlapping with each other and there is problem of coordination. So wherever there is overlapping of the tribunals, these tribunals would have to be merged. So by merging the tribunals with overlapping functions, we would be able to enhance their overall efficiency. Apart from that, the appointments to the tribunals must also be streamlined, wherein the appointments to these tribunals can be made either through a specialized agency or through the Department of Personnel and Training. So these are some of the strategies or the recommendations in order to improve the access to justice and make the Indian courts more productive. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now, the next article appears on page number 13. It is titled as US imposes the CAATSA sanctions on Turkey over the S-400 purchase. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 International Relations. Recently, Turkey, US NATO ally, decided to purchase the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. In response, US has now decided to impose sanctions on Turkey under the CAATSA law. This decision of US has significant implications for India as well. In July 2020, the Indian government had decided to purchase the MiG-29 and Sukhoi 30 fighter jets from Russia. Accordingly, Indian government then had asked for waiver on the sanctions under the CATSA from USA. However, the US responded by saying that waivers under CATSA are not country specific, and so far US has remained non-committed for the waiver to India on buying these fighter jets from Russia. Accordingly, let us understand the various aspects of the CATSA. Now, the CATSA here stands for Countering the American Adversaries Through the Sanctions Act. This particular act has been formulated by the US Congress in order to target the countries which America considered to be its adversaries. This law basically targets countries such as Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Under Section 231 of the CATSA law, the US government can decide to impose sanctions on those entities which have significant deals with the American adversaries. Take for instance, if India has a significant defense deal with Russia, then under the CATSA law, US can impose economic sanctions on India. What these economic sanctions can include: US can stop the export of defense goods to India, and it can also ban the American companies from investing in Indian defense sector. Now, a particular entity can be granted waiver from the sanctions under the CATSA law. This waiver can be given by the US President under the National Defense Authorization Act. However, in order to get a waiver, an entity has to fulfill a number of conditions. First and foremost, a country must have to reduce the reliance on the Russian weapons. Secondly, it must give in writing that it is ready to cooperate with US on important security related matters. Thirdly, the US President must believe that granting waiver from sanctions under CATSA would promote US national security. So, if these conditions are fulfilled, an entity can get waiver from these sanctions. See, as far as India is concerned, India has raised a number of concerns against the CATSA law. First and foremost, it has highlighted that 52% of the defense imports into India are basically accounted by Russia, and hence, accordingly, CATSA law would have an adverse impact on its defense preparedness. Secondly, CATSA is likely to affect the joint ventures between India and Russia, such as BrahMos, multi-role transport aircraft, and so on. Thirdly, it is also likely to affect India's purchase of spare parts as well as components of various defense goods which we had bought earlier. So, because of these concerns, India has raised a number of counter arguments. First and foremost, it has clearly said to US that whatever defense goods it is purchasing from Russia, it would not be used against US interest. As you must be aware, the defense relationship between India and US is growing stronger. US also treats India as a strategic defense partner. So accordingly, the Indian government has highlighted that on account of CATSA law, its defense preparedness would reduce, and thus this may have an adverse impact on US strategic interest. See, presently India has emerged as the second largest importer of arms and ammunition from across the world after Saudi Arabia, but almost more than 50% of defense imports are basically accounted from Russia. Hence, accordingly, the Indian government is presently seeking diversification of its import of defense goods from other countries, and hence, as part of its diversification program, the Indian government would reduce its dependence on the Russian defense goods in future. Lastly, see the CATSA law which the US has come out with in order to target its enemies' countries. This CATSA law may actually turn out bad even for US itself. This is because, as highlighted, India is the second largest importer of defense goods. So, if the US government decide to impose economic sanctions on India, this would have a loss to the American companies who would want to invest in India's defense sector. Secondly, the US government sees India as a strategic partner to counter China. It calls upon India to play a much greater role in the Indo-Pacific region. Hence, the US government should actually help India to modernize its defense forces. So that is why CATSA can go against the US interest. This is what you have to know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 6 and is titled as From a Digital India to a Digital Bharat. This article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the recent decision of the Union Cabinet to launch the Prime Minister's Wi-Fi Access Network Interface, which is also referred to as the PM Vani project. Now, in a DNS dated 10th of December 2020, we had discussed various features of the PM Vani project. In this particular DNS, we had discussed that any company, society, or an NGO can set up public Wi-Fi access spots. So these entities who are setting up of the public Wi-Fi access spot, they need not pay any license fee for providing broadband internet through these public Wi-Fi networks. So you as an user, you can get connected to these public Wi-Fi networks and thus browse the internet. Now, this article basically is highlighting various benefits and challenges with respect to the PM Vani project. See, you have to understand that digital infrastructure, it is considered to be a key enabler to promote good governance. It has a capability to transform India into a knowledge-based economy, empower people, and it is also considered quite crucial to meet various sustainable development goals related to education, healthcare, financial inclusion, and so on. In this regard, the launch of PM Vani project is set to give a fillip to digital infrastructure and thus promote the good governance. First and foremost, it is set to improve the internet penetration in India, which happens to be quite lower at 54%. It will enhance the access to the government services. Now, for example, government has launched the Umang app. Now, through this particular app, we can have access to a number of government services such as education, healthcare, and so on. Thirdly, these public Wi-Fi hotspots have interoperability. That is, users would be required to log in only once, and by doing so, they would remain connected across multiple Wi-Fi hotspots. The PM Vani project would also create a number of employment opportunities and enhance the disposable incomes in the hands of the small and marginal entrepreneurs and thus give a boost to the GDP of the country. Apart from that, presently the government of India is presently implementing the BharatNet project. The main emphasis of this particular project is to provide the high-speed broadband connection to all the panchayats in the country by the end of March 2019. However, there has been large-scale delays in the completion of the BharatNet project. Hence, the launch of PM Vani is set to give a boost to the BharatNet project. At the same time, there are a number of challenges and concerns with respect to PM Vani project. The first problem is with respect to the lower definition of the broadband. Now, according to the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, the definition of broadband in case of India is quite lower at 512 kbps. The National Digital Communication Policy 2018 seeks to provide for a broadband speed of at least around 50 Mbps. So if you look at the present definition of broadband as adopted by the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, it is quite lower at 512 kbps. In fact, recently the TRAI had come up with a proposal to increase the broadband speed. However, this was opposed by the telecom operators. The next problem is with respect to digital access and literacy, wherein only 10% of India's population have digital literacy. Apart from that, a large chunk of India's population living in rural areas, they do not have access to smartphones, laptops, etc. Another constraint is with respect to lack of regional language content. And the last problem is with respect to poor cyber security and data privacy. So we need to bring in the data privacy law as early as possible in order to ensure the data security of the individuals. So this is what you have to understand with respect to this particular article. Now the next article appears on page number 14. Now this particular article highlights that the High Level Financial Stability and Development Council has recently held its meeting. In its latest meeting, the Council has discussed as to what measures should have to be undertaken in order to promote higher GDP growth rate of the Indian economy. Now this particular article is quite important from the perspective of prelims. As you can see in prelims 2016, there was a direct question with reference to the Financial Stability and Development Council. See, the Financial Stability and Development Council was constituted way back in the year 2010. See, over a period of time, the financial sector in case of India has got diversified into a number of subsectors such as banking, insurance, pension, mutual funds, then the share market, that is the stock exchanges, and so on. In order to regulate these aspects of the financial sector, we have set up a number of regulators such as the Reserve Bank of India, SEBI, IRDA, PFRDA, and so on. Now, most of these financial regulators work in silos without any form of coordination between them. Hence, in order to ensure effective coordination between multiple regulators of the financial sector, the Government of India has set up the Financial Stability and Development Council. It is headed by the Union Finance Minister. It comprises of the chiefs of various regulating agencies. It also comprises of the Minister of State responsible for the Department of Economic Affairs, secretaries of the relevant departments, chief economic advisor, and the chairperson of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. So as stated before, its basic role is to ensure coordination between the various financial sector regulators. It also looks into issues pertaining to financial stability, inter-regulatory coordination, improving the financial literacy, improving the financial inclusion, and so on. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now, the answers to the questions that were posed before the start of the discussion has been presented on your screen. As far as answer to question number 2 and 3 is concerned, please find out the answers on your own and respond in the comments section. Now, coming to the question for the day. Now, the answer for the question for the day that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option C.